My name is Letitia Huckaby, and the name of this series is A Living Requiem. This project started with a commission for Texas Christian University to create portraits in honor of Charley and Kate Thorp, who were a formerly enslaved couple that were working for Texas Christian University before they moved to Fort Worth. And they were pretty much, they did everything for the campus besides teach. They cooked, they cleaned, they landscaped, they were the nurse, they did everything for this campus. And TCU has a project where they are trying to honor individuals who have contributed to the university that never got the recognition they were due. So they commissioned me to create portraits in honor of Charley and Kate Thorp. And since there are no documented images of the couple, I was able to photograph their living descendants as a sort of poetic stand-in for them. 2 of those images were used for the commission, and the rest of the images are here on display at the Modern for the Diaries of Home exhibition. The important thing for me was the descendants. It's something that they would be proud of, something that they feel would honor their ancestors. So meeting them was the most important thing. It was also important to hear like scholars talk about their perspective of the couple and what they knew. But for me, the family dynamic was really important. So I was really honored to be able to photograph them and include them in this body of work. You know, and interestingly enough, the family learned a lot through Texas Christian University about their ancestors, things that they didn't know. So the whole process for them was a learning experience and humbling at the same time. The way that I work is sort of evolving through the projects. I'm never really, I don't really know at the beginning of a project exactly what it's gonna look like at the end, if that makes sense. Things that happen over the course of making the work influence the outcome. So while I was working on this project, I was also involved in a residency in North Carolina and working on a third project there that had to do with another enslaved woman, and Harriet Jacobs. And while working on that project, there were things that sparked ideas for this project. So there's a lot of bleed over when I'm working. It's very fluid. The wallpaper actually comes from that project in North Carolina. So it's hard to say, you know, when I knew that it was going to be an installation. I've done a project like this, similar to this before, with another museum, and I wanted to replicate that, but have control over every last detail of the installation. The wallpaper in the first installation was not one that had historical significance for me. It was just a pattern. And so for this one, it was important to me that the wallpaper have historical significance, that the framing tied in with the idea and the images. And so I feel like this installation of Living Requiem is the first time where all of my choices have come together in one whole. So I was working on a project about Harriet Jacobs in Edenton, North Carolina. And while I was there doing research, I was able to tour a plantation that the state had just acquired as a historical site. They had literally just received the keys 2 days before. So I was allowed to be a part of the first group to go through this home, and it was a huge estate, like one of those 3-story houses with balconies on both sides overlooking the bay, just massive with the long tree-lined drive up to it and a rose garden in the front. And so we were going through the house, and it had been lived in recently by the descendants of the slave owners. So there was still furnishings and historical pieces in the house. There was 4-poster beds and, Victorian furniture and 3 different kitchens from 3 different time periods. And in the library, they had busts and paintings of the ancestors of that family. And in a dusty corner was this piece of fabric that had been stretched out on a wooden stretcher. And I don't know what it was used for, if it was hung on the wall or if it was over a bed as like a canopy or something, but this wallpaper is that fabric. And they allowed me to get a high resolution scan of it and use it for this purpose. But I loved the idea of taking something out of a plantation and using it, like shifting the use of it to support this family who came from an enslaved couple. So working with the family was wonderful. We have 15 portraits in this installation, and there's a very diverse range depicted here in this group. We have teenagers, we have college students, we have young adults, middle-aged individuals, and some seniors that are represented. They live in the Dallas and Fort Worth areas, and it was really nice working with them. I photographed them at Texas Christian University, and I didn't know how many people would come, so it was all a surprise to me when they showed up to be photographed. But they allowed me a space where I could hang up some vintage sheets and photograph them standing behind the sheets in silhouette. We initially had thought about using sheets that had purple heavily in them, but I did not like the idea of it being that heavily tied to Texas Christian University. I wanted it to stand on its own. And then we did look at photographing them in color, like the images were shot originally in color. But when I sat and thought about it for a while, I felt like black and white really added a kind of history and timelessness to the work. So I chose to have the images printed in black and white. So for the frames, which were cut out using a CNC router, and it's birch plywood, which is, plywood is just planks glued together. It's not the fanciest wood you can get, but I love using something that is not necessarily seen as precious and hopefully presenting it in a way that elevates your opinion about that thing. I feel like it's a direct connection to African American culture, where sometimes can be devalued and not appreciated unless presented in the right way. But as for the designs and the shapes, I was looking at memorial brooches and jewelry for the inspiration in the designs. And they used to take a locket of a deceased person's hair and braid it or twirl it and put it into this locket as sort of a keepsake. And since with this project I was honoring individuals who were deceased, but for me these ancestors are samples of their DNA, that it made sense to create these kind of brooch-inspired memorial to them. I started photographing freedmen's towns because I had an interest in my own family's history. My mom, who lives in Louisiana and is a descendant of slaves in Louisiana, doesn't live far from the plantation where our family was enslaved. And when I first started working, I was thinking about the lack of Black ownership with land, and how even oftentimes when we do get land, we value the money sometimes more than we do the land, and we will sell the land off. because it happened with my family. One of my ancestors was a product of a slave owner and a slave. And by chance, he actually acknowledged her as his child and left her a little bit of land. And that land stayed in the family for a little bit, but then when times got hard, my family sold that land off. And so I was really interested in going back to that land, and I photographed my mother standing on the land, and and then I started broadening out and looking at other areas that our family had worked, or what the land looks like that we do own now. So it was sort of a comparison between the enslaved properties and what the land that my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my aunts and uncles all live in kind of a similar area. It's like a little compound. So I started with that, and then I broadened outside of my family's property and started thinking about these Black towns. And I traveled mostly around the South and through the Dust Bowl, like Oklahoma and Kansas, visiting these places that used to be prosperous Black towns and photographing whatever was there, if there was anything there. So it was very much a landscape project. And then I did a project in Alabama, and my intention was for it to be a landscape project, but I was able to connect with descendants of slaves there, and the portraits became heavy in the body of work, and it was more balanced. It was sort of half and half landscape and half portraits of the people, and the people add something to the project that I really love. But when I got to this project, it was all about the people, and you could see the landscape just kind of disappeared, other than the references to land in the patterns on the sheets. So I started printing on fabric when I was in graduate school at University of North Texas, and I started using fabric. I had lost my father shortly before I started grad school, and he was from Greenwood, Mississippi, which was at the time, was like the 4th largest producer of cotton. And I never really thought about that growing up. After he died, I started looking at his life and his existence more, and thinking about, if you've ever been to Greenwood, it's very divided. Like on one side of the river is pretty much all African American, low income, struggling, and the other side is affluent, white community. And all the cotton fields are on this other side with the Black people. And so I really wanted to put cotton into the work. I started photographing cotton, and that wasn't enough. So then I started printing on cotton. And for me, that cotton fabric, people relate to it, but it also has this heavy history connected to it. So that's where I started working on cotton, and I've pretty much stayed exclusively with cotton since then. So, and the patterns that are in the portraits are actually cotton sheets that are vintage, that they're standing behind, and each one, sometimes I let them pick the pattern, or I'll pick the pattern based on whatever works I've already included in the body of work. Each one is its own thing. It's a one-of-a-kind, unique piece. So to me, it has a lot of history laced into it. And I started using the bed sheets because of my mom grew up on a dairy farm, and the only thing they got from the store was flour. And flour came in these cotton sacks that women would use to make clothing for their children. And I was able to find some of those, but they're not very big. So when I switched to doing larger works, I used bed sheets that had patterns similar to that as a connection to another time. Working with descendants is a very sensitive thing to do, because you never know how a particular individual is digesting all this information. There are some people who just the knowledge about their ancestors and what they went through and that they survived it is a sign of strength to them. And they take it on as sort of their own inherited strength. And there's others that can get so overwhelmed by the way that individual had to live and the choices that were taken away from them, that it's almost for them like being at a funeral. So I have to approach each situation with the understanding that not everybody's coming to it the same way, and I don't want to assume that everyone sees it the same way, because if I assume that everyone is just seeing pride in this story, then I'm gonna offend someone who sees this as a memorial, you know, and vice versa. So I always approach it by watching very carefully and listening to what the descendants are saying so that I can gauge where they're coming from and respond appropriately. And I always give them voice in the images. Like I show them the back of the camera when I take pictures, and if I've taken multiple images of them, I listen to what they like and don't like about the way they're being represented, and I use that. I respect that. So I'm always it's gonna sound weird, but I always feel like I'm the assistant when I'm working with descendants. I'm helping to tell their story. Looking at two communities, the group here that's in this exhibition in Dallas-Fort Worth area, and then also the group that I photographed at Africatown in Mobile, Alabama, is two different worlds. And I think it has to do more so with how long they've had the knowledge about those ancestors. The group here, this is relatively new. We're talking about maybe 2 to 3 years they've been aware of this history that they've had in their family. And so they're digesting this and taking this all in, and it's still very, very emotional. You can see it's right at the surface. They literally, when we did the unveiling at Texas Christian University, started crying. Is that sensitive for them right now, as opposed to the group in Africatown, which they've always known, and they've passed that history down through generations. They weren't always allowed to talk about it openly in community, but amongst themselves, they discussed it and they passed on their history and the names and whatever lineage they still had left from Africa as far as cultural songs or dances or foods. All that stuff got passed down. So they have this history that they can hold on to. So when you interact with them, they're much more in control of that history, so they don't feel as threatened by the outside or as sensitive to it. Now there's some of them that are still, you know, with the idea of them raising the ship in the Clotilda, they're still very sensitive about that. Some of them see that as a sacred place and don't want to mess with it, but as far as sharing their story or you know, any of that, it's a totally different experience. They're much more confident and willing to share that information. Yeah, I talk about my history with other descendants. You know, it's a really wonderful thing to be able to have those conversations, particularly like when I was working in Africatown, because you get a glimpse into what it was like for your personal descendants coming over here. Most African Americans don't know who their original ancestor was that came over on a slave ship and what that experience was like. So talking to those in Africatown who have heard the stories passed down, it kind of just, even though it's not my specific ancestor, it opens a door, and it just helps us all understand what those people were thinking, how they were feeling, how much they wanted to try to get back. You know, you know it, but to hear it firsthand from someone is a little empowering, maybe. Yeah, when I'm making work about descendants, I am thinking about community, but I'm also trying to share with the viewer a slice of home Like if you can put yourself in somebody's home, you're more apt to connect with them on an intimate level than if I just give you a snapshot of them. Like let's say if it was just one individual instead of the 15 with the wallpaper that feels like something you would see in your grandmother's house. You know, it's a totally different feeling when you walk through the space. And so I'm trying to transition, because they're tough subjects that we're talking about sometimes. And if I can soften it enough that you're attracted to it, you feel comfortable, this is a safe space, then we can have those conversations about, you know, the history of slavery or, you know, descendants and what their lives are like because of what their ancestors went through, you know. I've been really enjoying hearing the viewers' response to the work. And oftentimes, I don't know if it's because the work has a lot of fabric in it, people of many different cultures can relate to it, many different religions. I hear comments about, oh, this reminds me of my grandmother's house, or I think my mom had this sheet pattern. And that's really heartwarming to me because that means they're connecting to the work. And specifically with this installation, because it's in this sort of like long gallery space, I've heard multiple times that it might be one of the last spaces that people come through when they're exploring the exhibition. But when they turn that corner and come down this hall, there's an audible gasp. And I thought, okay, now we've got their attention.